In this topic, we're looking at graphic and design communication techniques for timber. And so this topic is really about drawing in various forms. So what types of drawings are we talking about here? Well, all design processes require some form of pictorial representation. Now, whilst there can be variations, most designers would agree that these representations fall under three broad categories, being visualization drawings, presentation drawings, and working drawings. And we're going to look at each of these. So visualization drawings, they're sketches for getting your ideas down quickly, for visualizing what is in your head. And I think the key there is quickly. Students in particular in schools can be worried about the quality of presentation, and so they tend to try to overthink their drawings. So it's a real skill that can really only be learnt through practice, where they can put their ideas down very, very quickly. So these can be quick sketches called thumbnails. They can be concept or idea sketches. These drawings can be rough or refined, they can be detailed, or they can be simple. And we'll go through some case studies so you can see how you can go from a simple visualization drawing to a more refined, detailed visualization drawing. These sketches are a record of your design thinking in the early stages of the design process and should increasingly demonstrate the influence of any research. Depending on the specific details of the proposed design project, there can be a lot of variation in the style of visualization drawings. Now, we will now examine two design projects from a timber furnishing perspective. So case study 1 is an entertainment unit. And just for a bit of context, this is the work of a New South Wales HSC student in industrial technology, and their project was one of the top projects in the state for that year. So they started off with thumbnail sketches. So it's a series of quick sketches recording broad ideas at the commencement of the design process. In this example, you can see how the designer is very generally experimenting with ideas around shape and proportion, along with some exploration of internal features. Visualization drawings can be done in either pencil or ink. It can be a good technique to do visualization drawings in ink, as it becomes too tempting to erase pencil marks, which can compromise the designing process. This is not the stage for refined drawings. Now, the other thing to note, but just by looking at these thumbnails, you can see that a few of them have got some asterisks in there. So you can see where from this sort of general experimentation stage, where the designer might be going with this project. So from thumbnail sketches to concept sketches. So the designer has selected some ideas from the initial set of thumbnails and is further developing them. It is possible to see from the drawings evidence of rough construction lines and evidence of a crating technique. However, it is important to note that these sketches are still rough and simplified, giving an overview of the potential product. The designer is not focusing on construction details or perceived production problems. So now we go to the next stage, and you can see now that there's some annotations starting to appear here. So the designer is now focusing on specific possible designs and is annotating the images to explain their thinking. Annotations are critical because they serve as reminders as to where your thoughts were at a particular stage of the design process. And it is very easy to forget, what your thinking was yesterday, last week, or last month. So it's good to have annotations there for that purpose. Additionally, as the design becomes more detailed, they are necessary to communicate specific features of the design to others for comment and feedback. So now we're moving through to the final concept sketches. So the designer has now decided on a final overall design for the product. It is important to note that the designer is still not delving into specifics relating to joinery, materials or processes in terms of the sketch, but is revealing their thinking and concerns through the annotations. And you can see just by looking at the sketch there, say for example down the bottom where it says leg shaping, they've said, well look, maybe this could be done by steam bending, maybe it could be done by laminating. So at this stage they haven't decided on a technique, but they're starting to annotate where their research is going to go. And definitely draw attention to the corner joinery, because this was one of the main features of the project. And they've said finger joinery, through dovetail, lapped dovetail, dominoed miter, keyed miter, dominoed butt. So there's a few different joinery techniques that they're considering, and are obviously going to have to do some researching and testing in that. So as I've written there, the large radius curves on the corners of this project are a key aesthetic component and represents challenges from the perspective of construction. This is expressed by the designer through their annotations. You can see that clearly there. And as we were just discussing, a key aesthetic feature and technical challenge for this design was the wide radius curved corner. The designer chose to make some more detailed sketches of this key component to develop their thinking and provide a focus for research in this area. And you can see with their thinking that they're heading towards this finger joint, which is what they ended up doing in the end. So let's look at this second case study. Now, I'm following exactly the same format. This was another student in the New South Wales HSC. Again, very, very high-performing student. So this is an exemplary presentation. So thumbnail sketches. So already you can see some similarities and some differences to these sketches as compared with the last case study. Both are done in ink. This student has done, different sizes, different thicknesses, whatever, but really it's the same thing in the sense that they're just looking at some of these overall concepts, shape, proportion, features, but in very general terms. And again, now they're same as the other case study, they're moving from the thumbnail sketches to some concept sketches. So they've taken some of preferred ideas from their thumbnails and they're developing them a little bit further. So you can see that there's some more detail in here. And they're going a little bit further now. So this designer is starting to introduce some annotations. And then they've moved on to some final concept sketches. So this designer has now decided on a final overall design. But again, you can see that they're not delving into specifics relating to joinery, materials or processes. So for example, they've talked about a woven shelf and timber basin, but they're not really getting into the nitty-gritty of how things are going to go together just yet. So now we'll move on to presentation drawings. So presentation drawings are the type and standard of drawing that is expected for a final design choice, or at least close to it. They are 3D, they show more detail and indicate what the whole product will look like. They are rendered and coloured to represent form and textures. Annotations indicate the proposed materials and to some extent construction processes. Annotations can also explain how the product will suit the end user and address the design brief. Additionally, they may explain aspects that cannot easily be seen in the drawing. So again, let's look at case study 1, the entertainment unit. So this is their presentation drawing. Now in this case, they've decided not to put annotations in here. The only sort of annotations that you can see just show the movement of the drawers in relation to the door on the front. However, it really does show overall what the final product looked like. In case of the bathroom vanity, they've used a slightly different drawing technique here, and you can see that they have put annotations onto this drawing. But you can see it's fairly detailed and accurate. So now let's get into some technical details on how you actually would produce presentation drawings. So there's a range of specific pictorial drawing techniques that can be used for presentation drawings, which we will now explore. There's more that exist out there. It's just that the ones that get used the most and the ones that are most effective, particularly for students in design and technologies, are the ones that we're going to look at specifically here. So isometric drawing is a frequently used form of pictorial drawing. It is easy to scale and construct while giving a semi-realistic appearance to the finished product. Isometric drawing is based on a grid with vertical lines and lines rising to the left and right at 30 degrees from the horizontal. That's it. Drawing tools such as a T-square and a 30/60 degree set square can also be used. All drawing is then carried out with reference to these lines. These lines are usually drawn very faintly as they serve as guidelines only. Now, obviously in the image there, those lines are drawn in red. They're just there just so you can see what's going on. I mentioned before a technique called crating, and that's where you basically draw those lines in very, very lightly, and they provide guides for you, or they can crate or sort of contain your sketch. But apart from those lines, every other line is drawn freehand. So the mobile phone music player opposite has been sketched using a freehand isometric drawing technique. It allows the designer to draw in 3D quickly and with a reasonable degree of accuracy. The design is still drawn at a 30-degree angle, although this is estimated or based off very light guidelines, as I discussed. The front corner of the object provides a starting point. When you have a starting point, use the T-square and triangle to draw faint construction lines at 30 degrees to the left and right, and a vertical line from the same starting point, as shown by the red lines in the image opposite. This is sometimes known as a chook's foot. And if you look at it closely, you might be able to see what I mean with some imagination. Okay, so there's another form of isometric drawing called an exploded isometric drawing. So designers use exploded views, often drawn in isometric projection, to show parts of products that are hidden from sight. For example, all the parts of the pen shown opposite can be seen because it has been taken apart using the drawing technique called exploded isometric projection. With exploded isometric projection, all the parts are in line with each other along a centre line. This is drawn precisely through the centre of the product being drawn. With a normal isometric drawing, all of the parts are in their assembled positions. This means that vital hidden detail cannot be seen. Now, another technique is called perspective drawing. Perspective drawing is a technique that can be used to give a realistic view of the completed article. Depending on the style you choose, the object may have 1, 2, or 3 vanishing points. And we're going to look at one point or single point perspective and 2-point perspective. So 1 point, which is what you can see being demonstrated there on the screen, or single point perspective drawing is the easiest method to use. The front view is drawn flat and the receding lines meet at a single vanishing point on the horizon line or the line of sight. The positions of the vanishing point and horizon line affect how you view the object. If your horizon line is low on the page, it appears as though you are looking up at the object. And if it is high, it appears as though you are looking down on it. Single point perspective is particularly useful when illustrating groups of objects that can be lined up with one vanishing point, or for creating an enclosed environment. For example, if you're drawing a furnished room or something like that. Two-point perspective drawing is a perspective method that is easily adapted to projects of different sizes. Because the object vanishes in two different directions, it conveys the feeling of distance and size very effectively. Two-point perspective is equally effective in presenting a single object and small articles. In two-point perspective, the vanishing points are located to the right and left of the observer on the horizon line. Vertical heights are always shown at 90 degrees to the horizontal, and the object recedes in both directions to the vanishing points. As with single point perspective, the positioning of the object and its vanishing points is important. In general, the vanishing point should be kept as far apart as possible, as vanishing points that are close together exaggerate the perspective. In fact, if you go back to the production drawings or the presentation drawings of the two case studies, they used two-point perspective, where the vanishing points were quite far apart. In fact, they were probably not even on the piece of paper. Okay, so finally we're just going to talk about working drawings. And there's another lecture that talks about Australian Standard 1100 where we go into this in more detail, but this is an overview. So working drawings are also known as orthogonal drawings, but can also be referred to as workshop or cabinet drawings. They are used by a production team or an individual to construct a project. They consist of systematically arranged views of the faces of an object, such as the front, top, and side view. However, more views may be used to show additional details as necessary. Working drawings may be drawn by hand or can be produced by CAD programs. They are usually drawn to a scale, but they can also be full-sized. Full-size drawings can be done on paper or on plywood, in which case it is known as a working rod. An advantage of a full-sized drawing or working rod is that the sizes of members and joints can be marked or taken off directly, thus lessening the possibility of an error in measurement. And working rods are particularly good if you've got a project or product that has lots of components. Third angle orthogonal projection is the accepted layout used in Australia. The rules that govern its method of presentation and the conventions used are set out by Standards Australia in AS 1100, Technical Drawing, but an abridged version is available titled Technical Drawing for Students. These rules ensure that line work, dimensions, lettering, parts lists, and sectioning, etc., are completed to establish standards so that communication of important details is clear. Key aspects of this drawing standard will be discussed in the next lecture. Many of these features, but not all, are demonstrated in the working drawings opposite. So let's go back to our case studies. So this is one of the working drawings from case study 1. This is basically their overall working drawing of the entire unit. However, they did have quite a lot of other drawings, one of which we're going to have a look at, that actually give detail on individual components and sub-assemblies. So in this example, it also includes a parts list. Now, third angle projection is used. An additional bottom view has been added due to the significant amount of detail in this section of the project. And then, as I just mentioned, due to the complexity of this project, more than one working drawing is required. So in this case, the designer produced a number of additional drawings showing detail of particular components and sub-assemblies. So you can see here, I've just included one as an example, and this is of the legs which were bent. So working drawings need to contain enough information to allow another person to construct the project. One of the things about AS 1100, and it relates to that sentence there, is it must contain enough information, but not too much. So for example, if one of your working drawings gives the information like the dimension of a width of a component, that dimension does not have to be repeated elsewhere in the working drawing. Okay, so now let's talk about rendering. And there's some examples here, and there's going to be some exercises coming up. So rendering, we might have called it back in kindergarten, we might have called it colouring in, but really it's a more sophisticated version of that effectively. So rendering is a collection of techniques used to make drawings more realistic by the careful application of shading, patterning and colour. So probably that word careful is the difference between grown-ups and what we might have been doing back in kindergarten. So for example, there's a few different techniques here. Tone shading is used to represent the areas of light and dark on an object if you imagine it being illuminated by a light source coming from a specific direction. Hatching uses a series of parallel lines to create the illusion of light and shadow by varying the distance between them. Texture shading is achieved by creating lines or patterns that represent the surfaces of various materials, such as wood, metal, brick, or glass. Colour is perhaps the most effective way to enhance your drawings. There are many techniques for colour application and just as many media. It's probably worth, if you want to go down that path, there's a lot of good resources on YouTube. So let's look at some exercises. And as I said before with sketching, rendering is a skill best improved through practice. I mean, we can talk about it as much as we like, but really there's not a lot of point unless you're actually practicing it. So here are some examples that I've done myself. So that's me, and I'm not too crash hot a sketcher or a renderer, but have had a bit of practice. So the first one of these is a simple rendering exercise similar to the example shown opposite. So what I'd like you to do is, rustle up some pencils from about HB through to 4B, so different levels of softness. Examine the example next door and seek to replicate its results, and upload your results into the discussion in the unit. There'll be a space there for that. So just to discuss that a little bit, so basically what I've done there is in the first one, I've actually just almost very, very lightly shaded on the paper, and I've blended it pretty much just by rubbing it a little bit with my finger. Now in the second example, you can see I've used that hatching technique where basically I've used lines of the same heaviness on the paper, but of differing densities. So I'm not pressing any harder or any lighter for anything there. I'm just using different densities. And it's the same thing with the final. In most of those, I did use probably a softer pencil, probably a 4B. Point density is similar to hatching in that I'm basically doing dots on the paper, but my shading relates to the density of the dots. So take some time to do those exercises. Just if you look very closely at that image, you'll see that I did actually give myself a little bit of structure there by creating a grid to work within, just neaten things up a little bit. You'll see very light construction lines there. The second exercise is two very simple rendered shapes. So freehand draw the cube using isometric techniques and render according to a light source of your choosing. And you can see in my images there, I have drawn in a light source, so you can see, where I think my light source is coming from. In the second one, lightly draw a circle as a guide and render according to a light source of your choosing to create the effect of a sphere. Then the final exercise is a simple rendered shape. So in this case, what I want you to do is use 2-point perspective techniques to recreate this hollow cube and render according to a light source of your choosing. Now, just so that you know, this particular drawing was not done using 2-point perspective. It was obviously hand done because it's not perfect at all, but it was done using what technique?